On the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Reichschancellor by the Reichspräsident Paul von Hindenburg. At this time, Hindenburg's Reichspräsidentspalais was being refurbished, and he was temporarily using the Chancellor's apartment, which now officially belonged to Hitler. As a result, Hitler had to make use of an apartment in the northern annex of the Reichschancellery. By the time Hindenburg returned to his palais, Hitler had already commissioned his architect from Munich, Paul Ludwig Trost, to renovate the chancellery, including the Reichschancellor's apartment. At this stage, neither Hitler nor Trost were aware of the fact that one of the intended changes would influence the construction of the Reichschancellery bunker, where Hitler would commit suicide 12 years later. This small extension to the garden facade of the Reichschancellery contained a garden room, which was originally built when the old palais was renovated to become Bismarck's chancellery. Hitler gave Paul Ludwig Trost the task of changing the garden room into a dining room with an attached winter garden. Trost's plan was to build the winter garden on the western side of the dining room. In the northern section of the winter garden, he would build a staircase to connect the dining room to the roof terrace. This new construction was completed in 1934. The architectural design was typical of the building style of the 1930s, yet its proportions merged harmoniously with the surrounding historic buildings. When Adolf Hitler commissioned Trost to renovate the Reichschancellery, he was particularly interested in the renovation of the Reichschancellor's apartment. This apartment, henceforth called the Führer apartment, was located in the upper floor of the northern annex of the Chancellery and was built in 1878 for Otto von Bismarck. Hitler wanted Trost to completely modernize the interior of the Chancellery. In spite of the extensive renovations, the roof terrace was still accessible from the Führer apartment. From the terrace, Hitler had direct access to the staircase, which connected his private quarters to the dining room below. Paul Ludwig Trost died in January 1934, while the renovation of the Reichschancellery was still in progress. The project was completed by his widow, Gerdi Trost. On the day Hitler came to power, he already knew that he would lead Germany to war. One of his intentions was to conquer Eastern Europe in a war of aggression. Experience in the First World War showed that future wars would not be confined only to fighting at the front, but would also reach into civilian centers. During the First World War, cities had already been bombed from aeroplanes and zeppelins, and the intervening years showed a marked advance in aerial technology. This meant that any preparation for warfare would have to include the timely construction of air raid shelters. This was the background against which the construction of the air raid shelter for the Reichschancellery was planned. However, the decision to build the shelter in the garden of the Chancellery could not have been made before the beginning of 1935. The recently built winter garden would have to be torn down to make space for the new structure. Therefore, the planning phase for the new building must have been very short, as it would not have made sense to complete the winter garden knowing it was about to be demolished. To provide the fastest access to the air raid shelter from the Führer apartment, it was decided to construct the shelter in the adjacent Chancellery garden. Since Hitler also wanted a new reception hall in which to receive foreign diplomats, the two projects were combined. Again, the contract was given to the Atelier Trost, but since Trost had passed away, his former partner Leonhard Gall drew up the plans for the reception hall and the bunker. It was feared that a large new building in the garden of the Chancellery would disturb the appearance of the old Baroque palais. To avoid this, plans were made to construct a new building on the property of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which bordered the Chancellery garden. Leonhard Gall planned to retain the new dining room, but to demolish the recently completed winter garden. In its place, a new and much larger winter garden would be built. The existing staircase would be included in the new structure, but it would be modified to fit into the layout of the new reception hall. This staircase would later provide the most direct route from the Führer apartment to the air raid shelter underneath the hall. The completed plans for the reception hall and the bunker were signed and submitted by Leonhard Gall in June 1935. The contract for the construction of the bunker was given to the company Hochtief AG. As there was never any intention to keep the location of the air raid shelter secret, it was possible to build it into an unconcealed open-air construction pit 6 to 8 meters deep. This made it far easier to cast large sections of the bunker in one piece, significantly strengthening the bunker walls. Due to the 1.6 meters thick concrete ceiling, it was necessary to build the bunker 1.5 meters deeper than the surrounding basement. This ensured an adequate ceiling height for the rooms inside the shelter. The main construction of the bunker was completed first, and then the basement of the reception hall was built around it. Thus, the bunker was built into the foundations of the reception hall. The existing staircase that connected the roof terrace to the dining room was integrated into the design of the new reception hall. As the staircase would now become the main connection between the Führer apartment and the air raid shelter, it had to be completely reconstructed. Firstly, it was shortened to fit into the interior layout of the reception hall. Additionally, the old wooden stairs were replaced by stronger, non-flammable stairs made of stone. Since the staircase had to lead to the entrance of the air raid shelter, it was extended downwards to reach to the level of the basement. The bunker was built with an interior height of 3.08 meters. If one subtracts 1 centimeter for the plaster on the ceiling and 2 centimeters for the floor covering, the result is an interior height of 3.05 meters. The total interior size of the air raid shelter was 18.9 meters from north to south and 18.5 meters from east to west. The exterior walls were 1.2 meters thick, and the interior walls, which divided the shelter into 21 rooms, had a width of 50 centimeters. The entire bunker was constructed from reinforced concrete. The main entrance to the air raid shelter was located in the southeastern corner, directly opposite the staircase. Aside from the entrance, the bunker was also equipped with 2 emergency exits. One exit was located in its northeastern corner, and the other, smaller exit was located on the western side. The entrance and exits each led to an airlock. A guard room helped to secure access to the bunker. To reach the main section of the bunker, one first had to pass through the guard room. From here, one entered a large central connecting room through which the rest of the shelter could be accessed. The largest room in the bunker contained the generator and the air filters. Opposite were the restrooms, which also contained showers. Since no photographs were taken of the interior of the bunker before the end of the war, it is uncertain exactly how the rest of the shelter was utilized. It is likely that most of the rooms contained benches for seating and that some were reserved for Hitler's personal use. In addition to storage rooms, there would probably also have been a medical room where minor procedures could be performed even during a bombing raid. The entire bunker was covered with a concrete ceiling 1.6 meters thick, able to withstand the most powerful bombs existing at the time. In conjunction with the construction of the bunker ceiling, the surrounding basement walls were connected to each other by beams made of reinforced concrete. These connecting beams formed a grid which spanned the entire basement. This enhanced the lateral strength of the basement walls, which were constructed from ordinary bricks. The beams also provided a solid foundation for the floor of the reception hall. The basement rooms were connected by passages on the eastern and western sides of the shelter. These could be used as escape routes, should it become necessary to evacuate the bunker in an emergency. The rooms and passages that surrounded the shelter also had another function. They created a space between the exterior walls of the building and the bunker itself. This offered additional protection, as bombs which hit the construction from the side would explode in this space before reaching the air raid shelter itself. At the entrance, as well as the main emergency exit, a flight of stairs led down 1.5 meters from the basement to the bunker. In order to make it possible to walk upright down these stairs, it was necessary to cut steps into the ceiling above. This meant that the bunker ceiling only reached its full thickness at the doors to the airlocks. Between the floor of the reception hall and the ceiling of the basement was a 50-centimeter high air cushion. This meant that the ceiling of the basement was 50 centimeters lower underneath the reception hall than in the rest of the basement. This height difference was very visible in the area shown here, where the basement of the reception hall met the basement underneath the winter garden. The reception hall provided extra protection to the air raid shelter. However, should it have collapsed, it could have actually endangered those using the bunker by trapping them inside. Because of this, certain additional safety factors were taken into consideration in the design of the hall. The exterior walls and the 12 massive marble columns formed two nested rectangles, which supported the roof. In this manner, the weight of the roof was spread, enhancing the stability of the entire structure. The columns rested directly on the strong bunker ceiling and were protected from shock waves by the exterior walls. The roof structure consisted of a lattice of interconnected metal beams. At its base were two rectangular steel rings resting on the exterior walls of the reception hall and on the marble pillars respectively. This lattice-like construction ensured that, should sections of the walls or some of the pillars collapse, the roof could still be supported by the remaining walls and pillars. The bunker ceiling provided a strong enough foundation that the columns alone would have been able to carry the entire weight of the roof. Likewise, should some of the pillars have collapsed, the exterior walls could also have supported the weight of the roof. In this way, it was ensured that even if the reception hall sustained severe damage, the roof would not collapse entirely onto the bunker below. The choice of copper as covering for the roof was also influenced by concerns for the safety of the bunker. Copper was an ideal choice of material, as it is not only lighter than the roof tiles normally used, it is also non-flammable. The ceiling of the reception hall was made of a layer of plastered wire mesh, approximately 1 centimeter thick. This layer formed a net-like structure, which was suspended underneath the roof, ensuring that, should the ceiling be damaged, only light pieces of plaster and wire would fall to the ground. This door in the eastern wall of the reception hall provided access to the staircase which led from the Führer apartment to the basement. It was planned that during an air raid, the staircase would provide the shortest route to the bunker for guests in the reception hall. The air raid shelter and the reception hall were designed to form a static symbiosis. As previously mentioned, the shelter, with its thick concrete ceiling, formed a solid foundation for the marble columns in the reception hall. These columns reached 50 centimeters downward through the air cushion beneath the reception hall floor, resting directly on the bunker ceiling. The placement of the pillars was also determined by the layout of the shelter. Each pillar was placed squarely on top of an intersection between two bunker walls. The extra pressure bearing down on these intersections added strength and stability to the air raid shelter. Due to this symbiotic design, it would only have been possible for the entire reception hall to collapse onto the bunker below after several direct bomb hits. The chimney of the reception hall was unusually high for a building of this type and was closed off by a small extension. Instead of the usual opening at the top, vents were placed in the sides of the extension. The height of the chimney, as well as the placing of the vents, also played a role in the safety of the air raid shelter. Due to the height of the chimney, most of the glowing sparks would have died by the time the smoke reached the vents. A standard chimney, with its opening at the top, would have been seen from the air as a glowing point in the night. As the bombers of the 1940s had to find their targets by sight, a glowing light from a chimney would have been a serious safety hazard. The reception hall was bordered on three sides by structural extensions. This annex on its northern facade contained residential apartments for Hitler's closest aides. Living here on the premises of the Chancellery, they were available to him at all times. On the eastern side of the reception hall was this low passage, which connected the apartments to the Reichschancellery. Aside from their individual functions, these extensions, as well as the dining room and winter garden on the southern facade of the reception hall, also served to protect the bunker. They formed a girdle which surrounded the hall, providing extra support to its exterior walls should the hall be damaged during a bombing raid. From an architectural point of view, the appearance of the reception hall represented Hitler's personal taste. The Atelier Trost had been erecting buildings for Hitler since before 1933. For these buildings, Trost had developed an architectural language based on the classical, which today is considered to be typical of the National Socialist era. But the appearance of the reception hall shows that there never was a typical National Socialist architectural style. Instead, classical elements were used and combined in whatever manner best suited their purposes. Consequently, with the reception hall, Leonhard Gall designed a building which seems, from its exterior appearance, more like a rural mansion than an official building of the German government. With its wall lamps, shutters and plastered facades, the building could have been a summer house on one of the Brandenburg lakes. In the autumn of 1937, it was time to test the capacity and effectiveness of the air raid shelters in the Berlin government district. As part of the preparation for the drills, officials needed to know if the shelter underneath the reception hall could be used for the staff of the government buildings or if Hitler wished to set it aside for his own use and that of his closest aides. The State Secretary was asked to consult Hitler on the matter, and after 3 weeks Hitler reached a decision. The bunker would be reserved for the use of the residents of the old Reichschancellery. From 1937 to 1939, Albert Speer greatly extended the Chancellery. As part of this project, he erected a pergola which fenced in the entire Chancellery garden. To prevent this from interfering with the view of the reception hall, he had the pergola end before it reached the building, allowing only its back wall to be extended to reach the facade of the hall. More apartments were constructed in the garden of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. These were for the use of Hitler's closest assistants and were built against the back wall of the pergola. One of the buildings was higher than the pergola roof. This was the so-called Haus Kemper, the house of Hitler's personal driver. As part of the construction of the new Reichschancellery, Speer also made alterations to the old Chancellery. He restructured the pond in the Chancellery garden, simplifying its design and adding a fountain. He also completely rebuilt the southern annex. This annex was dramatically changed in 1928 during the construction of extra office space for the Reichschancellery. An extra story was added to the extension and its facade was completely modernized. Speer restored the annex close to its original proportions by allowing its height to be determined by the height of the roof of the Palais. Thus, the existing walls were retained, but the modified shape now harmonized with the surrounding architecture. The upper floor of the annex contained the Red Salon. Speer had to make these alterations without destroying the original walls in order to preserve this historic room. A dining hall had to be built for the new Reichschancellery. Albert Speer connected the hall to the southern wing of the old Chancellery. Speer demolished the Bismarck passage to create space for the new construction, but he replicated the arched shapes of the historic passage in the facade of the new structure. The ground floor of the annex was converted into a kitchen. The storage room for the kitchen was located in the basement underneath it and could be reached by staff via an escalator. The changes made in connection with the construction of the Reichschancellery were even more extensive on Voss Street than on the side of the Chancellery Gardens. In the 19th century, Bismarck tried, without success, to prevent the construction of apartment buildings on Voss Street. He was of the opinion that the presence of residential buildings devalued the entire government district. Albert Speer demolished all the buildings on the northern side of Voss Street to clear space for the new Reichschancellery. As justification for tearing down these buildings, Hitler referred to the process as a delayed compliance with Bismarck's wishes. However, neither Hitler nor Speer mentioned the embassies of Saxony, Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria or the Ministry of Justice by Wilhelm von Werner, all of which were also located on the northern side of Voss Street and demolished at this time. 2 air raid shelters were built into the basement of the new Reichschancellery. The smaller one of the 2 was located underneath the right wing of the Eastern Administration Building. It had 29 rooms and was reserved for the use of the Reichschancellery staff. Adolf Hitler used the bunker underneath the reception hall. A much larger air raid shelter was built under the central section of the new Reichschancellery. The decision to make this air raid shelter accessible to the public was quite strange, as it was situated beneath the section of the Chancellery where Hitler's office was located. The shelter consisted of 5 separate bunker sections, aligned but independent from each other, containing 55 rooms. The different sections of the air raid shelter were accessed via hydraulic doors, which were built into the pavement of the street above. These doors could be opened from inside the bunkers and provided direct access to the airlocks of the separate bunker sections. At this stage, the air raid shelters of the new Reichschancellery were not connected to Hitler's shelter underneath the reception hall. To reach his bunker from the new Reichschancellery, Hitler had to walk through the entire building complex. Even though a large dining hall had been built in the new Reichschancellery, Hitler preferred to use the old dining room near his private quarters. However, the storage rooms for kitchen supplies were now located in the basement underneath the kitchen of the dining hall, in the southern annex of the Palais. This meant that all the supplies needed for the kitchen of the smaller dining room had to be carried through the entire old chancellery. As it was unsuitable for the hallways of an official government building to be used in such a manner, it became necessary to find an alternative to this arrangement. Therefore, a service passage was constructed in 1939. In preparation for the construction of this passage, a door was built into the exterior wall of the storage room. Another door was built into the basement of the reception hall, at the point where the passageway would connect to its southern exterior wall. The service passage itself was most likely constructed from prefabricated concrete pieces. Its height was reportedly 2.3 meters and its width 1.2 meters. The roof of the service passage was about 80 centimeters beneath the garden surface. The passage now provided a direct route from the storage room to the basement of the reception hall. From here, the staircase connected the basement to the dining room of the old Reichschancellery. A layer of tar was painted onto the concrete exterior to prevent moisture from penetrating into the passage. The house manager of the Reichschancellery was Arthur Kannenberg. He was also responsible for all kitchen supplies. As the service passage was used for the sole purpose of moving these supplies, it was soon nicknamed by staff the Kannenberg Passage. After the work on the passage was completed, the garden was restored to its original condition, leaving no sign of the underground passageway which connected the new and the old Reichschancellery. Since it was built as a service way for staff, it had no function connected to Hitler's bunker at the time of its construction. But this would soon change. On the 1st of September 1939, only 9 months after the opening of the new Reichschancellery, German forces invaded Poland on Hitler's order. 2 days later, Adolf Hitler met with his closest aides in his office in the new Reichschancellery as the foreign minister von Ribbentrop translated England's declaration of war. France's declaration of war followed a few hours later. The first sustained bombing campaign by the Royal Air Force between August and December 1940 made it clear that Hitler would need his Berlin bunker. At the time, bomber aeroplanes were not yet technologically prepared for such attacks, and due to lack of experience, the air raids were not very well organized. However, these first attacks on Berlin demonstrated the importance that the air raid shelters would have later in the war. It was at this time that also Adolf Hitler started to make use of his bunker. From the door of the Führer apartment, Hitler had only to cross the terrace to reach the staircase. The staircase, which was originally constructed to give Hitler private access to the dining room, now became an emergency route. Hitler met the other residents of the old chancellery, also hurrying to the safety of the air raid shelter, here at the door to the dining room. He then passed the door to the reception hall. This door was kept locked, as the bunker was reserved for the use of Hitler and the residents of the old Reichschancellery. It was especially important for those in the old chancellery to evacuate the building as fast as possible, since the old palais would offer no protection against bombs. From the ground level, the basement could be reached by a narrow staircase. This staircase led around a wall which served as additional protection for this part of the basement. The main entrance of the shelter was located directly opposite the staircase door. Hitler only needed approximately 2 minutes to reach the bunker entrance from his private apartment. The passage, which the residents of the apartments in the northern extension of the reception hall could use to reach the shelter, also led to this point at the main entrance of the bunker. From here, people passed in small groups through the airlock and into the bunker. Early in 1940, a line of phosphorus paint was applied to the basement walls. The phosphor would glow and cast some light in darkness, which made it possible to find one's way through the basement even during a power failure. In the first years of the war, the majority of the population of Berlin had only provisional shelters and had to wait out the air raids in their cellars, hoping that their houses would be spared a direct hit. The few public shelters were only accessible to Germans. Jews were not allowed to use them. Adolf Hitler, however, did not have to be concerned for his safety inside his Reichschancellery bunker. It was equipped with its own power supply and an integrated defense system against gas attacks. It would have been possible to spend days inside the bunker uninterrupted and completely sealed off from the outside world. It was not permitted to leave the air raid shelter immediately after the bombing had subsided. Only once the all clear signal had been heard would the doors of the bunker be opened. It is very likely that the bunker would have been kept in a state of readiness at all times from the start of the war. It was necessary to keep the air pressure inside the bunker higher than the average air pressure outside. This meant that the airlocks had to be used to leave the bunker, even when an air raid had ended. The bunker exit had a similar design to the entrance described earlier. Several steps led upward to reach the floor level of the basement, which was 1.5 meters higher than the floor of the shelter. The northern exit offered the shortest route to the apartments next to the reception hall and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At this time, Adolf Hitler and his ministers could not have guessed that these attacks would soon become far worse. Their armies were stationed deep in enemy territory and had faced no significant opposition. From this position of strength, they assumed the air raids would be a temporary burden. Yet, by the end of the aerial offensive of August to December 1940, Berlin had already heard 37 alarms and was bombed 6 times. 200 people had been killed. The intensity of the bombing by the Royal Air Force eventually subsided. The aircraft were needed at the front, and Berlin received a last reprieve. In spite of these raids, for the people of Berlin the war was happening far away on the battlefields at the front, and Berlin could still be defended successfully by the Luftwaffe and the anti-aircraft batteries. But the bombs that fell on Berlin in 1940 were just the beginning of a firestorm which would soon consume all of Germany. The fire which was started by Adolf Hitler and had spread across Europe was about to return with a fury to its point of origin.